At this point, if we have, Mr. President, I will have some comments entertained from Senator Cruz. Question?
Would the senator from Kentucky yield for a question?
Don't yield for a question. I don't yield the floor, but I'll acknowledge a question to the chair.
Thank you, Senator. I'd like to ask your reactions to the testimony that Attorney General Eric Holder gave this morning in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I'd like to describe that testimony for you and then ask your reaction to that testimony. And I will begin by saying that senator after senator on the Judiciary Committee invoked your leadership on the issue of drones and asked Attorney General Holder about the standards for drone strikes in the United States. And indeed, although you do not serve on the Judiciary Committee, it was as if you were serving in absentia, because the Attorney General was forced over and over again to respond. And I would note that you're standing here today like a modern Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, must surely be making Jimmy Stewart smile. And my only regret is that there are not 99 of your colleagues here today standing with you in defense of the most fundamental principle in our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, namely that each of us is endowed with certain unalienable rights by our Creator, and that first among them is life, the right to life and the right not to have life arbitrarily extinguished by our government without due process of law. Now, at the hearing this morning, Attorney General Holder was asked about the letter he sent you, in which you asked him whether the United States government could use a drone strike to kill a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil. And as you know, Attorney General Holder responded in writing that he could imagine a circumstance where that would be permissible, and the two examples he gave were, number one, Pearl Harbor, and number two, the tragic attacks on this country on September 11th, 2001. And in the course of the hearing, Attorney General Holder was asked for more specifics on that, and in particular, both of those were military strikes on our country with imminent and indeed grievous loss of life that flowed from it. And few, if any, disagree that the United States government may act and act swiftly to prevent a military attack that would take immediate loss of life. The question that Attorney General Holder was asked 3 different times was whether the United States government could take a U.S. citizen who was suspected of being a terrorist on U.S. soil, who was not engaged in any imminent threat to life or bodily harm, who was simply sitting at a cafe. Could the United States government use a drone strike to kill that U.S. citizen on U.S. soil? 3 times when asked that direct question, Attorney General Holder responded that in his judgment that was not, quote, appropriate. Now, the first question, and if I may, I'd like to ask a series of questions. The first question, does it surprise you that the Attorney General would speak in vague, amorphous terms of appropriateness and prosecutorial discretion rather than the bright lines of what the Constitution protects, namely the right of every American to have our life protected by the Constitution?
Well, Mr. President, I am quite surprised, although I guess I shouldn't be, that we don't get direct responses. You know, it's a pretty direct question. It's the question I've been asking all morning. It's the question I've been asking for a month and a half, because I'm really talking about situations where you have a non-combatant, someone not posing an imminent threat, who they think may someday pose an imminent threat, because that's what we're doing overseas. If that's the standard overseas, I'm asking, is that going to be the standard here? So it amazes me, and part of the reason we're here today in the midst of a filibuster is because they won't answer the question directly. So I applaud the attempts to try to get a more specific question, and I guess I'm not terribly surprised that we have had trouble getting a direct answer.
The senator yield for additional questions.
As long as I don't yield the floor.
After 3 times declining to answer a direct question, would killing a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil with a drone strike when that U.S. citizen did not present an imminent threat? Would that be constitutional? After 3 times simply saying it would not be appropriate, finally, the 4th time, Attorney General Holder responded to vigorous questioning. In particular, in the course of the questioning, the point was made that Attorney General Holder is not an advice columnist giving advice on etiquette and appropriateness. The Attorney General is the Chief Legal Officer of the United States. And I will note that I observed it was more than a little astonishing that the Chief Legal Officer of the United States could not give a simple, one-word, one-syllable, 2-letter answer to the question, does the Constitution allow the federal government to kill with a drone strike a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil who is not posing an immediate threat? The proper answer, I suggested at that hearing, should be no, and that should be a very easy answer for the Attorney General to give. Finally, the 4th time around, Attorney General Holder stated, quote, "Let me be clear, translate my appropriate to no. I thought I was saying all right. I thought I was saying no. All right? No." So finally, after 3 times refusing to answer the question whether it would be constitutional to do so, the 4th time, the Attorney General asked that. And so the questions that I want to ask is your reaction to this exchange, and in particular, when Attorney General Holder, on the 4th time, finally stated his opinion, and I assume the opinion of the Department of Justice, that it is unconstitutional for the federal government to kill a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil who does not pose imminent threat. When he stated that, my response was that I wish he had simply said so in his letter to you to begin with. I wish John Brennan, in his questioning that you provided, had said so to begin with. And indeed, I then said that the senator from Kentucky and I are intending to introduce legislation in this body to make clear that the United States government may not kill a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil if that individual does not pose an imminent threat of death or grievous bodily harm. And I observed that if the Attorney General's view was it was unconstitutional for the U.S. government to do so, that I assumed he would be supporting that legislation. I would welcome your reaction to that exchange.
Mr. President, the response is a little bit troubling that it took so much work and so much effort of cross-examination to finally get an answer. I will note that in his final answer, I don't ever see the words constitutional or unconstitutional. He is responding to Senator Cruz's words of constitutional. He says, let me be clear, translate my appropriate to no. I thought I was saying no, all right, no. Well, words do make a difference, and I would feel a little more comfortable if we would get in writing a letter that says he doesn't believe killing people not actively engaged in combat with drones in America on American soil is constitutional. Sure would have short-circuited and saved quite a bit of time. I will say, though, that I'll believe a little more of the sincerity of the President and of the Attorney General if we were to get a public endorsement of the bill that says drones can't be used except for under imminent threat, and define that as an imminent threat where you actually have a lethal attack underway. And if we could get to that, I think this is something that really both parties ought to be able to unite by. It's such a basic principle that I can't imagine we couldn't unite by this. And I think you've gone a long way to try to getting these answers. But I guess what still disappoints me about the whole thing is that it takes so much work to get people to say they're going to obey the law. It takes so much work to get the administration to admit that they will adhere to the Constitution. This should be a much simpler process. But I commend the senator from Texas for not letting go and for trying to get this information, and would welcome any more comments that he has.
The senator would yield for one final question. Is the senator from Kentucky aware of any precedent, any Supreme Court case, any lower court case, the decision of any president of the United States, beginning with George Washington up to the present, the stated views of any member of this United States Senate, beginning with the very first Congress up to the Senate, up to the present. Is the senator from Kentucky aware of any precedent whatsoever for the proposition that this administration seems unwilling to embrace, or at least embrace explicitly and emphatically? Namely, that the Constitution somehow permits, or at least does not foreclose, the United States government killing a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil who is not flying a plane into a building, who is not robbing a bank, who is not pointing a bazooka at the Pentagon, but who is simply sitting quietly at a cafe, peaceably enjoying breakfast. Is the senator from Kentucky aware of any precedent whatsoever for what I consider to be the really remarkable proposition that the United States government, without indicting him, without bringing him before a jury, without any due process whatsoever, can simply send a drone to kill that United States citizen on U.S. soil?
Mr. President, I'm aware of no legal precedent for taking the life of an American without the Fifth Amendment or due process. What is troubling, though, is that Attorney General Eric Holder is on record as actually arguing that the Fifth Amendment right to due process is to be determined and is to be applicable when determined solely by the executive branch. And I would appreciate the comments and opinion of the senator from Texas on the idea that the executive branch gets to determine when the Bill of Rights applies.
If I may continue my questioning and give my views on that question and ask your response to my views on whether the executive may determine its own limitations, I would suggest the genesis of our Constitution is found in the notion that the president is not a king, that we are not ruled by a monarchy, and that no man or woman is above the law. And accordingly, no man or woman may determine the applicability of the law to himself or herself. For that reason, the framers of our Constitution won not one but two revolutions. The first revolution they won was a bloody battle for our independence from King George. And a great many of them gave the ultimate sacrifice so that we might enjoy the freedom we do today. But the far more important war they won was the war of ideas, where for millennia, men and women had been told that rights come from kings and queens and are given by grace to be taken away at the whim of the monarch. And what our framers concluded instead is that our rights don't come from any king or queen or president, they come from God Almighty. And sovereignty does not originate from the monarch or the president, it originates from we the people. And accordingly, the Constitution served, as Thomas Jefferson put it, as chains to bind the mischief of government. And I would suggest that any time power is arrogated in one place, in the executive, that liberty is threatened. And that should be a view that receives support not just from Republicans, not just from Democrats or independents or libertarians. That should be a view that receives support from everybody. That none of us should want to live in a country where the president or the executive asserts the authority to take the life of a United States citizen on U.S. soil without due process of law and absent any imminent threat of harm. I would suggest the idea that we should simply trust the Attorney General, trust the Director of the CIA, trust the President to exercise an astonishing power to take the life of any U.S. citizen. That trust, in my judgment, is fundamentally inconsistent with the Bill of Rights, and I would ask the senator from Kentucky's reaction, if you share my understanding that our rights are protected not at the whim or grace of the executive, but they are protected by a Constitution, and ultimately they are rights that each of us was given by our Creator, and we are obliged to protect the natural rights to life, liberty, and property that every man and woman in America enjoys.
Well, Mr. President, this is what makes this debate so important. This debate is about fundamental rights that most of us, or many of us, believe derive from our Creator, and that it's important that we not give up on these, that we not allow a majority vote or one branch of the government to say, we've now decided you don't get all of these rights anymore. Our founders really wanted to make it difficult to change things, to take away our rights. And so this is an important battle, and one in which I think we should engage, because the President needs to be more forthcoming. The President needs to let us know what his plans are. If he's going to overrule the Fifth Amendment, and if the Attorney General is going to decide when the Fifth Amendment applies, that's a pretty important distinction and change from the history of our country.